Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our fourth customer webinar of the year. Today, we're looking at lists, loops, checks, and triggers. So, for those of you who are new to Questback and our customer webinars, my name is Michael Courtier. I'm the Client Success Director here, and I'm a regular voice, somewhat croaky today on our customer webinars, and I'm absolutely delighted by an old-timer here at Questback, Kiarash.
Hello, everybody. My name is Kiarash Matavi. I'm a senior technical consultant, and I think I'm right in saying that Michael and I are both probably some of the longest-serving members of the UK team, at least, at Questback.
So the pressure's on now to make sure we get answers to all your questions today as we go along. So the agenda today is pretty much reflecting what we're covering on the email we sent out to you. So looking at lists, both static and dynamic, then loops, because one really flows into the other typically, looking at plausibility checks, and then finally triggers. We've put a Q&A at the end, but please do stop us without. If you want us to repeat something, a bit of explanation, etc., etc. Very happy to try and take questions as we go along using the webinar features. If not, we will get to them at the end. Now, as you know, with our customer webinars, we do try to pitch them at a range of different abilities. So today's more the intermediate level. So we're kind of expecting you're already creating basic questionnaires and then looking to sort of take things to the next level. And that's where lists, loops, checks, and triggers all really come into play. So without further ado, going to look at incorporating lists into your survey. And we have two kind of lists here at Questback that we can implement to the system, static or dynamic. Now, a static list is literally just a list of information uploaded or typed in as part of the survey creation. So in many ways, it's very similar to the answer options you might put into a standard question. So it's just an item after an item after an item. So it could be a range of counties of the UK and things like that. And it's literally a list as long as you want it to be within reason that you can upload via CSV or Excel or type in. Now, a dynamic list is very similar, but it's actually dynamic in the point of view that it's created upon answers to a previous question in the survey. So in effect, it's an answers already given. So you might ask someone what their favorite ice creams are, and they give you 3 different answers. And then your new list is based on those 3 different answers they've given you. So a good example over Leaf of what we mean by static and dynamic. So we are very cheesy here at Questback, very cheesy. So we've put a nice list of cheese there as a static list. And you can say, okay, what's your favorite cheeses? And then the person could select halloumi, Stilton, and bizarrely feta. It's hard to believe, but they're the 3 cheeses. And that would be the dynamic list, i.e. based on a question they've already asked. So as you know, we do like to go into EFS very quickly in these sessions. So let's have a look. And here we go. So we're into a little survey I put together accordingly. And what we do is we go into questionnaire editor. And you can see right at the very bottom there, at the left-hand sub-menu, we have lists. And this is where we can create our new lists. And it gives you 2 options at the top, dynamic or static. So I'll show you the static, that's slightly easier one to show you. And first thing it says, what name do you want to give it? So I will give it my own name. And then, do you want to use a wildcard at all? So typically you can just give it the same name. And you can see there also it just defaulted to that. And you can overwrite it if you want. If you're showing it in a questionnaire, it gives you a couple of handy features here where you can say, well, do you want it to be separated with commas, or you might want it to be an or sign. And at the end, do you want it to be with an and or with something else? So a lot of very handy little features you can put in as you go along with defaults. And once you click save, you can then add in all the different elements one by one. As you would expect, we have an import list elements just here. If not, you can literally type them in. So let's pretend my one might be what's your favorite version of Michael? So version 1, good Mike. And then finally, and please have this one, Mikey. And there we have it. As simple as that. A new list that we can then use throughout the survey process whenever and wherever we want to. And what's really quite nice is that as an extra feature, you've got an inclusion condition. So it's very similar if you've done filtering or hiding conditions. And you've got some very similar options here. You can say it's always in the list, it's never in the list, it's in the list if, etc., etc. So a good example I like to show around this is that you could have a list of clothing retailers. And you could say only show certain ones in the list if the person identifies as female or male and vice versa and things like that. And you can start to get quite clever with your lists as you go along. And you even have at the top there some wildcard settings. And you could slightly change the name of things depending on the person who's taking the survey based on other criteria. So there's a lot of flexibility and power around the lists. And what we've got nice is that actually can show a little preview of the questionnaire here. Actually just shows you a list in action. And here we go. Here's the list that we uploaded earlier, literally one after another, all these different cheeses. And obviously, which ones haven't these that you tried might be a better question. Apologies to any vegans on the call today, but some of these are available. And then the first one was a static list. They said select your favorites, and there we go. We have a dynamic list as we go along. So nice and easy there.
Right. So now talking about loops, and it's really appropriate to have loops in this training session because they kind of link in very neatly into the idea of lists. So let's have a quick look at that. The idea behind a loop is a kind of structure where you can use a number of items and iterate through them one at a time and ask the same question for each of these items to see what your respondents think of it. So in this case, the example that you might guess already is going to be about the cheese list that we created a few minutes ago. So we're going to go through that. However, in general, the routine is to create a dynamic type page of the kind loop, and then select a list within that page in page setup. And then you create page or pages inside of that loop structure. And the questions that you put in usually use the hashtag that you saw a little bit earlier, what we also call them live, wildcards. And those are the item text that appear. So the items that have been selected and are part of the list now will appear in each iteration. So just to tap back into the survey again. All right, so here's one we made earlier. In fact, what I'm going to do for you is show you where the item appears, just to kind of go through the process and show you what it looks like. Where you need to look is this dynamic section that I'm highlighting right now. You can click on that, find the loop option, click on loop, and then you get a couple of options underneath. I'm going to give it a name that I tried before, loop test. You get a couple of options underneath that says instead of blank, standard page into a new branch, because without this extra page, the loop's pretty much useless. It's just going to go to the next section. And the next bit is jump to list selection after creation. Again, a loop only makes sense if you have a number of items that you're going to iterate through. And you do that by picking a list. So I'm just going to click OK on this. Just to see what I'm going to pick. In this case, I'm not going to select the cheese for this example. I'm going to select Michael because he's a buddy of mine, known him for years. Then we're going to click Save, and that's going to be the list that I'll be using. The next thing I'm going to set up, just to show you guys, you don't really need to set this up in most cases, but just in case you need to, or you want to do something a bit more interesting with list that's not completely standard, you can go to the properties and you can set some of these properties for the elements that you have. So it tells you what elements are in the list. You can randomize the way the questions are ordered, so it's not in the same order as the list that was generated. And you have a number of options to do that, to kind of order the list itself. You can also, I think, if you notice, there's an option to select items in a list randomly. And if you use that for creating your list, then you have more options here to do stuff within the loop. So as with any kind of demonstration, like, I don't know, cooking programs, etc., we have one that we made earlier. So I'm going to go through an example, and I will be doing that by following from what Michael selected, which is, I'm just going to pick all of these just to show what happens. So just to show you in the questionnaire, the loop that we're going to show you is this cheese tried loop. And this list has been created here in this particular question. And if you look, there's a little item that says there's a list there, and you can go and inspect it. It's a dynamic list based on the elements you selected. And that's kind of what's happening here. I've selected some items previously. I've created the cheese tried list, and I'm going to use that in this loop and ask a question about it. So let's have a quick look. And this question is going to be asking, what is your favorite own brand of that particular item in that iteration of the loop? And we're just going to keep going. There might be some bits and pieces in here that we're going to kind of skip over quickly because it doesn't really relate to what we want to show you. Yes, this is a question, and I'm going to rate some stuff because why not? Here you go. So what is your favorite own brand of Camembert? And we have a bunch of options. That's what the question asks, but this bit is a dynamic part. So if you go to the, let's just say Tesco's, I don't even know if that's my favorite brand or not. Let's go to the next one, and then it's looking at cheddar, and so on and so forth. It will look at every element that was selected in that list. So that's pretty much a quick introduction to lists and how connect with loops and loops themselves. So let's move on to the next bit.
Thanks, Josh. Really nice way of cutting down the amount of questionnaire editing and creation that you have to do when you're looking at asking the same information about a range of different criteria rather than to write it out again and again. So the next thing to look at was plausibility checks. And what is a plausibility check? It's probably the first part to start with this. And it's a check on the data inputs in the system to ensure it's in line with pre-established criteria. It's quite wordy, isn't it? But really what you're saying is it's just doing a quick check against what someone's put in to make sure it makes sense. And there's a wide range of checks available. We've got standard checks. I'm going to run through quite a few of these with you when I actually open up the checks on EFS, but range checks, emails, formats, and also tell you what the difference is between server side and client side as well. And what's quite important, and what mistakes some people make, is that you need to create the question first. So you think, yeah, I know what I'm doing. I want to do an X, Y check, X, Y, Z check, but also make sure the question first. Excuse me, and then go to the plausibility check submenu and create the check based on the question. So let's go into EFS itself now, and I can show you that. So go back to our questionnaire editor. Let's say we want to put plausibility check for some reason on the very first kind of question over here. And then you can see on the left-hand side, we have plausibility checks. That will always be on the left-hand menu whenever you click on the different questions. So clicked on that, and nice little sign there. It gives you a bit more information. But let's click on plus to create our new plausibility check, and it will show you all the different elements allowed. So let's just put Michael in here again as our title. So we have standard checks, we have range checks. So range checks are quite nice. I won't go for every single one of these, but a range check is a number range in effect. So you could ask someone how old they are, and that way you can put a range in saying, well, it has to be between 18 and 100, for instance. May not be appropriate for your survey, but you get the idea there with the ages. And if they put a number outside of those, you can say not allowed or amend the message accordingly. We have email address checks, format checks, i.e. it has to be in a certain format they write things in. Regex checks are quite nice. That's in effect like a mini database lookup. You pre-populate the information in the background. Could be hundreds of items in there.
Yeah.
They will very quickly look it up against that, and if it's not in there, it will then throw it out and say not allowed.
Yeah, it's a nice way of defining the format of a particular input, a particular thing that your participant is going to write about. So it could be like a postcode, it could be addresses, or a certain type of number, maybe phone numbers, things like that, where this kind of check can help you specifically make sure that it's in the right format. Also, you can find this. Regex is a little bit complicated. You can find a lot of information about it on Google. You can go, and a lot of people have created regexes before for various things. I mean, a lot of companies like the post office has their own regex that you can go and look up. So that information exists in places that you can check. Very useful.
Fantastic. So let's pretend we're doing a range check here. Click on proceed. And then on the next page, it says users may ignore this check. So in effect, can they override it and say, no, my data is fine after all. It's your question that maybe is wrong, which can be quite a handy feature to put in. And then it's saying, oh, who's going to check this? Is it going to be client side, i.e. your computer in effect is making the check, or is it be done at the Questback Towers on the server, or maybe both? This is very handy from the point of view that some corporations, they have their computer set up in such a way that the JavaScript won't work.
Yes.
So we can override that and say, well, we definitely do the check our side. So if you're not sure, probably best just to use a default of client and server, because that way, one way or the other, the check's going to happen. And you can execute the check if one of the items are hidden or not. So sometimes you'll have some hiding functions on the page, hiding conditions, and you still want to execute the check in those situations. So you could set up a very annoying survey where you're doing a plausibility check on something that's hidden and therefore can't be amended by the person, and they can never get through to the next page. So when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense to be able to turn that on and off. And lastly, they can just see what error message do you want. So it's nice you can change that. So if it really was about age, you could say this age doesn't make any sense, or please enter a value between 18 and 100. Something quite nice to kind of give the person a hint.
Yes.
And then this is very similar now to sort of your hiding and filtering conditions. You have negation, you have brackets, and then say what the value is. And you can say what question, and then it has to be within the range of, say, 1 to 100. And then you can actually put a plausibility check upon a plausibility check. Say, well, on top of that, I need a second range check, or I need a regex check. And there's a whole range of things you can do and start to get very, very sophisticated and, dare I say, complicated as we go along. That's really the power, again, of EFS, that you can go to these great levels, great sophistication with what you do. Excuse me.
Yeah, it's really, really useful to have the ability to create something very specific to what you need. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And then you can click save. As you can see, I haven't actually created a proper one then. And then that theoretically would work. Excuse me. Then also very easy to get rid of it again. So we just go back to our plausibility checks. And you can either copy it if you want to use it over and over again. You can check it's actually going to work.
Yeah.
And lastly, delete. So let's just get rid of that one now, because it obviously won't make any sense.
That's right. Right. So I think it brings us nicely to triggers. So let's see what triggers are. Triggers are actions that occur based on a particular event or something that has been selected. An event would be something that has been selected in your survey, or a response that has been highlighted, or any of those things. And the idea is that based on, after the activation of a trigger, depending on the trigger type, you can do certain things. There are a large number of triggers, but some of the more common ones are these. So you've got sample triggers, page triggers, logout triggers, so on and so forth. So I'm not going to go through each one of them. So sample triggers are pretty common, where you start from a questionnaire and, for example, you ask somebody a particular question and might be related to a different survey that you have, and you can use a sample trigger to kind of guide them to this other survey, and they can start taking part in that. It's a bit more complicated than that, but that should give you an idea of the kind of places it's being used. Page trigger is a little bit like, if you're a bit of an old coder like me, it's a bit like your go-to statement, where you can jump people between pages. And like all those kinds of navigations, it does have the issue of sometimes it's difficult to follow what your survey is doing if you use them, but they can also be very useful if you've got an unusual way to navigate around the survey for your participants. Logout trigger sends people out. Like some of the other ones that's really used a lot is a recording trigger. The idea behind this is that you have some data that you're collecting, but you want to change its shape to something else. So you can use it for reporting, or for later on in the survey for whatever reason, maybe like filtering or routing around the survey. I think Michael, there's a good example that he always has for this, that kind of tells me about for recording triggers. I can't remember what it's about though. Is it about like the NPS question types? A really good example. Yeah.
So I quite like that one. So for the NPS question, typically it's on a 0 to 10 scale. Then I like to have a hidden question in the survey. And then you can just set it up for 3 different variables. So 9 and 10 being promoters, 7 and 8 neutrals, and the rest for detractors. And what you can have in effect is a hidden variable that gets recoded on the fly that gives someone a 1, 2, or 3 based on a detractor, promoter, or neutral. So just a nice hidden way of doing that in the survey.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example of where you might want to use this kind of the triggers in general. So lucky enough, we're at the page level right now, based on the previous example that we were looking at. And you can see there where the trigger is. So there is a trigger option here that you can click on and see what triggers are available. In this example, we don't have any triggers available, but what we do have if we go back to the questionnaire area, and you guys probably know about most of these already, triggers show up as a little icon on the right-hand side that tells you where you've created triggers before. So in this example, we've created a mail trigger before. The idea behind that is that you can fire off an email to a particular person if somebody, for example, gives you a really bad score, or a particular manager has been really kind of put down through a survey, and you want to let them know that maybe they need to go and talk to somebody. Maybe not the best example, but that's kind of the idea. So you can click on the trigger, and in this case, you can see that it's doing a particular thing, and the way you set it up is very similar. So let's just create a new trigger anyway. You can select the kind of trigger that you want, give it a name. I'm not actually going to create this. I'm going to show you the other one that we've done. And you can select the type that you're looking for. Some of these are available in other surveys that are not here. So depending on the survey type, you have a different number of items. The one that we were going to use in this case is that mail trigger. And there's a little bit of explanation of what that actually does. So going back to the triggers that we do have, the mail trigger that we've set up here, to edit it, I'm going to click on that. And there's a number of options in the configuration setting. That's really good to know. Of course, you can give it a title, put a description in, but this option is quite useful because it sort of defines when the trigger gets activated. Is it going to be examined as the page is just as the page is about to load, or is it going to be examined afterwards? And if there's a filter afterwards, how it's going to behave. So you have a number of options to determine what that behavior is. You can set up a condition that's going to be checked for the triggering of this, and also you can, if you're testing the survey in preview mode, you can turn these options on to be able to see how that works. The next thing we're going to look at is the detail configuration, and this is different depending on the trigger that you're looking at. In this example, we have an email trigger, which means that I can bring a mail template and use that directly, or you can set one up from scratch, which is what Michael's done in this case. Thank you. So it's got a mail sender, we have a person that's going to be sent to, we have a type of email to be sent out, and we have some message that's going to be sent out. And you can use wildcards as well. There's some information about wildcards here if you click on this. But I think you probably have used mail templates. I think there's other training sessions on that you can look up to help you with that. That's pretty much what a trigger does. I'm not going to run this because all it does is going to send an email to somebody. I'm not really sure, probably Michael. And we haven't got his email really working at the moment, so it probably wouldn't show up. That's pretty much, I think, all I have to say on triggers for this session.
Yeah, so we're two really nice examples there. One is like if you get a particularly low NPS score, you might do it via sort of a closed loop feedback system. But if you're not going to that level of sophistication, just literally if you get a score of something or under, then it fires off an email to someone.
Yeah.
Or another one is I've seen someone using like a whistleblower type survey. So very luckily, it's very rarely used, a survey. And then every time it is, it literally fires an email off saying, we've actually had a response on this. Go check it out, because it's a very important whistleblower type survey. So two nice areas there of what might be used. So looking at the Q&A now, and we've had a few come in as we go along. So the very first one is asking about when should you loop? That's a good question, actually, because, yeah, what we've shown you today, it's funny, isn't it? You could easily recreate just by having the same survey questions a couple of times. And I think personally, it's up to you, Karash, as well, but it's kind of personal preference. I personally think when you're doing it about 3 or 4 times, that's fine. Because after you get past that, it's probably where it makes sense to put a loop in. There's no hard and fast rule, but don't know if you have a personal preference.
Yeah, I think it's a personal preference, and it does make your life a little bit easier in some cases, but you just have to, like a lot of things, try it to see if it helps you with what you need to do. It's probably the best answer I can think.
Yeah, I definitely would never be creating a loop for 2, put it that way.
Yeah.
That would be a waste of time.
Exactly.
But they're probably up 3 or 4 onwards. The next question is about using a plausibility check for date of birth. What you could do with that. You could, but however, actually, I wouldn't recommend that, oddly enough. What you're quite right, you could set up plausibility checks. We actually have a date picker question. Anyone who's ever tried to recall date of birth in surveys can know what a nightmare it can be. It seems there's so many different ways of entering a date of birth. It's unbelievable. So what we'd recommend is using the date picker question, and that way you can pretty much guarantee the data is going to be recorded sort of in a standard way in the variables in the back end. So yeah, even though you could, we wouldn't use a plausibility check there. We'd actually just use a different kind of question instead.
It's a much nicer interface as well to use for that. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Another question that came up was about list versus hiding conditions. This is a really good question. So as you're probably aware, you can use hiding conditions to simulate what a list does essentially, or just use them out of the box. And what they do is they show and hide items based on what people have selected previously. So in effect, they look exactly the same. I personally prefer lists because they're just easier to use in lots of places in your survey. So you can use a list everywhere, and it's also less maintenance and less effort to reuse. So for me, it's a nice structure that helps you to do that. Another question that came up was to do with lists and if you can do anything with them in filters. Really good question. It's something that I think we were going to talk about, but we decided not to talk too much about because of the amount of time we've got. And here's an example of it. So a lot of the stuff that we went through in the survey that we demonstrated, there is a filter here that decides if this section of the survey is going to be executed if there's enough items being selected from a list. And as you can see, it uses the initial size of a particular list, in this case, the list of favorite cheese, to direct you inside this area and ask a whole bunch of other questions. So yes, they can be used quite effectively as a way to route you around the survey.
Fantastic. I've got one more question here that's just come in, and it's asking the limit number of plausibility checks. There is actually a limit in the system. I don't know what it is, but it's a very high limit. Like a lot of EFS, the limits are almost absurdly high that it's quite hard to reach them. So what we'd seen some horrible examples with some questionnaires where before you've even got to the first set of questions, you've had like 100 different sort of plausibility checks and recoding going on, and then the customer phones up and wants to know why the survey is going a little bit slowly. So really, it's a case of being sensible and looking at sort of how many things you're asking it to do. And if you're unsure, give the help desk a ring and we kind of talk around what would be sort of a sensible way of approaching it. So yeah, there are some hard and fast limits to the system, but it's more a case of being sensible and then spreading out any kind of recoding and plausibility checks as you go along, rather than having a big hit of say 100 on the very first page of recodes. It is possible, but that's sort of not recommended. So thanks so much everyone for your time today. We're going to be back in approximately 1 month's time looking at the latest EFS release, our spring release, and all the advantages and features that are coming out as part of that. So invites will be coming out very soon. But as for now, that's everything. Thank you.
Yep, thank you from me. Cheers.